Welcome to Voices of Australia, a podcast where we explore different perspectives on how to build a cohesive society. Australia is poised at what Dr. James O'Donnell from ANU calls a critical juncture. In an ever-shifting global context, we find ourselves navigating rapid technological advances, changing demographics, and the pressing mandate of environmental action. While many might perceive these macro challenges as the domain of policymakers in distant corridors of power, the reality is that their actions echo profoundly within our communities, homes, schools, and workplaces. They influence every facet of life in Australia. So what does the roadmap look like for our nation? What key policy decisions will define our trajectory in the next decade? How do we build bridges between the present challenges and a vision of an Australia that is prosperous, inclusive and sustainable? In today's episode, we'll delve deep into these critical questions, guided by the insights and expertise of our distinguished guest, Danielle Wood. Danielle Wood is the CEO of the Grattan Institute, a preeminent Australian policy think tank. Her expertise encompasses a range of pivotal areas, from economic reforms, budgets and tax adjustments, to women's workforce engagement and generational inequality. Previously holding prominent positions at the ACCC and the Productivity Commission, Danielle is also a trailblazer for women in economics, co-founding the Women in Economics Network. She serves in significant advisory roles within the Australian government and is an honorary fellow of the Economic Society of Australia. Welcome, Danielle.
Thank you so much for having me, Anthea. Delighted to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure on our behalf. We're really excited to spend some time with you and hear a little bit more about how you think Australia is going to progress over the next decade or so. But with your vast experience in economic policy, how do you envisage Australia's strategy should be responding to the pressing global challenges of both climate change and technological evolution? A nice big question to start with.
It certainly is a big question. I mean, I think if we're thinking about climate change, that is going to require a fundamental transformation of our economy over the next 25 or so years. So we've said at a federal level, as well as actually every state, have committed to a target of net zero by 2050. My colleagues here at Grattan in our energy and climate program call it an industrial revolution with a deadline, because when you think of what is involved in that transition, it is a fundamental reshaping of our electricity network to get a very, very high penetration of renewables. That means a huge amount of building renewable power and connecting it into the grid. It means a transformation of our transport networks and the way we move around, the way we build our cities and live in our cities. It's a transformation of our agricultural processes. So every part of the economy is going to be touched by this, and it's happening and it needs to happen quickly. So it is a huge shift, and I think people are only just really now starting to get a handle on how big that change will be. That is not to say that it is all bad or scary. Of course, there are, transition issues that have to be managed, and we know there are, for example, certain regions and communities where carbon-intensive jobs in things like the coal industry are very concentrated. So we need to think about the transition for those areas. But there's also lots of opportunities in this. We are a country with incredible renewable resources. That opens up things like possibility of green manufacturing using hydrogen. We have big reserves of some of the key critical minerals and rare earths that are going to be needed to build all the solar power panels and the batteries and the things that are needed for this transition. So it will shape our economy, it will change things, but it comes with a lot of economic opportunities for Australia as well. So that's the climate piece. I think you're very right to raise digital and technology. It does certainly feel like we're on the cusp of another sort of economy-changing wave of innovation with AI and data analytics. Interestingly, at the moment, Australia is lagging. If we compare on league tables of OECD countries, we tend to be slower adopters of some of those technologies. So I think, if we want to be, at the forefront, growing our economy and productivity, we need to think about how it is we adopt those technologies and filter them through the economy. And I think, I come from a world where I think a lot about government policy. So governments do play a role. They play an enabling role in terms of making sure we have the skills that we need in our economy, which is the combination of training as well as having a well-functioning skilled migration program. They play a role through things like cybersecurity and making sure that companies are able to invest safely in these areas. And they play a role as leaders as well. I mean, governments are big providers of services. Things like health and education can be areas where these technologies really transform how we do things, and governments can play a leadership role in that. So I think there are lots of opportunities for us, but it does require us, really being on the front foot.
So Danielle, we haven't always been slow in the uptake. I mean, we are one of the have been very active uptakers in solar panels on houses. We were very early adopters of mobile phones. Why do you think there are some areas where we're slower than others?
Well, it's interesting. So those areas that you raise, Anthea, are areas where the consumer is deciding to pick up the technology. And you're right, we are regarded as often quite early adopters of these new consumer technologies. Where we have tended to be slower is in business adoption. And, there's some interesting data on this. Australia tends to sit, behind what I would call the sort of best practice frontier when it comes to management skills. So we tend to be sort of less good on standard metrics of management than places like the United States. And when you break that down, actually, the area where we fall most short is in terms of digital. So Australian managers report feeling less confident in identifying the technologies that will make a difference to their business, and then less confident in rolling it out and deploying those. And we all know that, major IT transformation is very hard. And it's something that, we don't seem to have the kind of confidence and expertise in. So, I think that is something we need to think about, given how important these technologies are going to be just to doing business in every area of our economy going forward.
It is a really interesting area because, you just have to look at banking to understand the legacy issues to do with technology that just make everything that much more difficult. But given we have a relatively unique position in the global world, the global arena, if you like, around all sorts of different things, and we probably have quite a big voice in some areas and maybe not in others. Maybe that's an acknowledgement of where we are strong and not so strong. But how do you think we should be positioning ourselves, or Australia should be positioning itself in the future within the global context?
Look, I think, we've always been, or for a long time, we've been a sort of middle-sized economy and a middle-sized power. And look, I think, realistically, that's will continue to be the case. We do have scope to provide leadership in some areas. We're pretty unique geographically. I think, being a sort of Western industrialised economy adjacent to Asia, we have advantages both in terms of our sort of economic as well as our cultural ties with the region. So I think that does give us some leadership in some of the issues, particularly as they play out in Asia and in our backyard. So I think it's probably a matter of, picking the ones that make sense for us as a nation, but recognising, of course, in terms of relative size, where we are not a major power and nor are we going to be. So it's using our influence in a strategic way.
I'd be interested to know where you think those particular strengths are. I think one of the things that has been sort of an interesting discussion has been about what is Australia's vision for its future and where are the real industries where we can grow and develop those real strengths. Have you got a view about where you think those might be? What are the areas where Australia should really try to maximise and capitalise that influence it can have?
So look, in terms of sectors of the economy, I mean, I think I touched on it when I was talking about the green transition. I think this is really an interesting area. It is an area where, technology is evolving very rapidly. But as I said, we do have huge amounts of renewable resources, lots of land. And, when you look at opportunities in things like hydrogen, potentially it does open up new sectors for us to be competitive where we haven't been competitive in the past. So if you think of something like steel manufacturing, I think is a nice example. Historically, we've sent the iron ore overseas, we've sent the coal to generate the power overseas. We've done some of it here, but not on a big scale. When you start talking about green energy and hydrogen, it's much more expensive to export the energy. So you potentially turn the economics of that industry on its head. And it may be now that it becomes economic to produce at scale in Australia and export elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really interesting. I think there's other areas where historically we've had comparative advantage and we will continue to. Agriculture is a good example, and we have, really, really efficient agricultural systems, and we're really important in sending those products out into the world. In the services economy, higher education, I think, is a great example. We've built up a very successful industry that attracts students from around the globe, and particularly in our own neighbourhood, that has been a major export industry for Australia, and I think, will continue to be. So when I look forward, I think it's a combination of continuing to do the things we have done well, as well as looking for new opportunities as the economy evolves.
Can I ask you a question sort of tangential to this but related? In the space of agriculture, some of the experiences and knowledge that come from other communities elsewhere in the world, I think of African communities, and those areas have developed agricultural techniques that potentially have an opportunity to inform how we do agriculture here. Do you think we're good at actually learning from other cultures and bringing that into the way we do things here? Or do you think we're more focused on that technological advances that we keep expecting to have happen?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Look, I suspect a lot of the focus has been on technology, and certainly, agriculture is a sector that has, transformed because of technology. My guess is that we're not as good at the learning, and the more obvious place you might think is learning from our Indigenous people. Yes. That we're here for tens of thousands of years, pretty successfully managing the land and feeding themselves. I think that is growing, our willingness to learn from different cultural practices, and we talk about that more in terms of land management now. Whether that extends to learning from overseas, I don't know. But I think the countries that are successful and the industries and sectors that are successful should have an open mind and want to pick out best practice from elsewhere. And I think that's something we actually, certainly in the policy world, we do a lot of as Australians. We're often looking around for what works in different parts of the world. So I think the more of that we do, the better.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I'm curious, though, that we often have little hubs of great advancements occurring, whether it's sort of niche manufacturing or even in some agricultural components of areas where we do things differently and make become internationally known for that particular technique. Or do you think that the population is more progressive than policy, and is that always the case? Is policy always a bit slow in regard to catching up with the broader population's views, or am I misunderstanding the Australian population's ability to integrate and be ambitious around what we might be able to achieve?
Look, I think as a general rule, you're right to say that policy tends to lag community. And I think that's probably true in social issues as well as economic issues that you're talking about. There is an inherent risk aversion within government. And you know, that's sort of an understandable risk aversion. If you just do the same thing over and over again, even if it doesn't work, you probably don't get in that much trouble because you're just doing the same thing. Whereas if you try something new and it goes wrong, you know, everyone's going to point the finger at you and say, why were you trying that silly thing? So it does push policymakers, and this is true of politicians as well as public servants, into a world where they are probably more risk averse on average than we would hope they would be, and probably than the community is, as you're pointing to.
So you mentioned climate change and technology. Do you think they're the main levers that policies need to start to view as being paramount to Australia's prosperity and cohesion going forward? Are they the main two areas that we need to really focus the policies on going forward?
I think they're two critical ones. I mean, I would probably add a third, which I think also brings in both prosperity and cohesion, which is education. Because I think, you know, in a world which is, you know, pretty much a sort of mainly services economy, human capital is absolutely critical. And there's a, you know, lovely quote from Bill Gates where he says, you know, the best leading indicator of where a country will be in 20 years' time is its education system. So the way in which we, you know, invest in those future generations, that's going to be a critical driver of our prosperity and innovation going forward. But also, you know, it is also critical for social cohesion, I think, because it's about, you know, dampening economic differences, making sure that everyone has equal opportunity regardless of, you know, which family they were born into or which part of the country they were born into. So I'm a very big believer in education and an education system that's working well. You know, I know this is not a podcast on education policy, so I won't go into detail, but there's many things I think that we could be doing better. It's not just about spending more money, but we could be doing better in our school education system as well as in our skills and higher education systems. So I think, you know, really investing in that as an area of policy would be the third one that I would add into that mix.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I think we might return to that as we go along.
Great.
But trust in government has really been quite a consistent thread throughout this series. Considering your involvement with so many initiatives like the Women's Economic Equality Task Force, how do you think we can strengthen public trust in our institutions?
Look, it's a wonderful question, and this is, you know, certainly something that has occupied some of my mind while I've been in policy world, because, you know, trust matters for getting done. You know, it matters for a whole lot of reasons, but if you don't have trust in government, it's harder for government to do these sorts of policy reforms because they don't have the sort of the social license or the capital to do that. So, you know, I think it's worth, and you may have discussed this on previous podcasts, just noting the sort of trajectory that we had this decline in trust from, and this is, you know, beautifully picked up in the Social Cohesion Index. From about 2009 onwards, we had sort of this decade of decline in trust, which all of us were worried about. We saw mirrored internationally as well, at least across Western nations. We were seeing the sort of same decline. Jumped up again during COVID when everyone was, you know, really looking to government for answers, and then seems to be moderating again. But I think there is no single answer to why it declined and therefore what we can do about it. I think there's some uniquely Australian aspects. We changed a lot of prime ministers during that period, and I think people were pretty shocked by, you know, the fact that they went to bed one night and they woke up with a different prime minister, you know, not who I voted for. You know, and fair enough, it kind of looked like we had a political class that was interested in themselves and not thinking about the country. I think we have a tendency for politicians to overpromise and underdeliver on policy. So there are a lot of very tricky areas. I mean, housing affordability is one very much in the focus now, but we have been talking about it for a long time. When people say they're going to fix that problem, you create this expectation that it is very hard to deliver on. And I think that is ultimately damaging to people's trust. Yeah. And then you've got a kind of whole set of things around the institutions themselves and how they function. So we've done a lot of work, for example, on the power of vested interests and the way in which interests can use donations and lobbying and public campaigns to try and skew the public debate. And they get a sort of disproportionate say in policy outcomes. You've got issues around the way governments themselves act, abuse of entitlements, jobs for mates, a whole lot of things that goes to self-interest. So I think people in those systems actually taking on integrity is a central component of the role, but also setting up the system so it is harder for those abuses to occur, because I think all of that just chips away at public faith. And I really, I feel so upset when I see another one of these scandals. I just want to bang my head against the wall, because I know that there's just a whole lot of people in the public out there saying, they're all the same. Why shouldn't we listen to them? And I understand that reaction from the public. I mean, I feel the same frustration, but if we switch off and we say they're all the same and, we don't have faith in our institutions, then it's very hard to get change. So, cleaning up politics and political decision-making, I think could go a long way to slowly rebuilding that trust.
Oh, absolutely. And I think whatever we should not forget that in actual fact we are a highly cohesive society, and in general we really do trust those institutions within, that are part of the functioning of Australian democracy and how we operate. But at the same time, you're absolutely right. The coverage of the media and social media and the impact that can have is not to be underestimated.
Exactly. And we want them to be better. We are very lucky that we don't have, I think, kind of deep corruption. So even this kind of grey corruption we want to stamp out, because we can be even better.
Absolutely. I think we all desperately hope and want that to be the case, for them to be as good as they can be. Your advocacy on women's workforce participation and generational inequality has been really notable. How do you see those areas influencing Australia's future, in as much as do you see that we're actually making progress around women's workforce participation? And do you think we have a full enough understanding about that intergenerational inequality?
So look, on women's workforce participation, I actually do think we're making progress. We come out of COVID with the highest rate of women's workforce participation on record, incredibly strong participation. We still have very high rates of part-time work amongst women by international standards, and a big gap in that full-time participation between men and women. So I think, there is scope to go, but I think increasingly we recognise this as both economic opportunity. We have incredibly highly trained women in this country, and so at least giving them the choice and opportunity to work more if they would want to. So this is things like supporting more affordable childcare, so that women have the choice to go back to work. I think that's now increasingly recognised as a really important economic driver, as well as a driver of better economic outcomes for those women as individuals. So I think that conversation is changing. We've seen some movement on childcare. The government is promising to do more. They are, I was a member of the Women's Equality Task Force, because you said, lots of thinking more broadly about how do we unlock this potential, this incredible resource that we have sitting there, so that women are able to make that choice. So I've been really heartened by the direction of that policy conversation, to be honest, Anthea.
Yeah, that's great.
On intergenerational inequality, I'm going to be a little less optimistic. I think that's an area where we have struggled to get progress. So, my concern really is that we are setting up a generation to be less well off than the one before. And, I think we have this expectation and a great expectation of generation on generation progress in living standards. I think we should want to leave the country a better place for those that come after us. And I think there's a number of fronts in which we haven't been doing that. Climate is a very big and important one, and we've already touched on that. So I won't go into that, but it's a massive transfer between generations. Housing is another really important one, and increasingly it is extremely difficult for a young person on even a middle income to get into the housing market. And, that concerns me. And now we're seeing big increases in rent as well. So younger people are spending more and more of their budget simply on a place to live. And that then curtails their opportunity to do other things, to take risks, to live close to jobs. So all of those things, I think, are hurting the living standards, at least on average, of younger Australians today. And then we do have this kind of slow burn issue around population ageing that you touched on in your introduction, which has a big impact on government's fiscal position, and therefore things like how much tax and how many services we might expect in the future. As the population ages, we're going to have fewer people of working age who tend to be net contributors to the budget on average. For every person over 65 who tend to be net drawers on average. So that just makes government budgets harder to sustain. We're going to spend a lot more on things like age pension and aged care. And I think no one begrudges that. We all want our older Australians to have a good standard of living in retirement, but we haven't planned, and particularly in our tax system, we don't have the revenue base to support that at the moment. And as I said, that's a slow burn issue, but we've been talking about it for a long time, and we haven't, I think, yet done the proper preparatory work. If we don't, we just shift that burden onto the next generation to come.
Yeah. I think, one of the areas that sort of relates to that, to what your just comments then, which is really to do with whether or not economic growth can actually ensure that the benefits are spread across the communities. Because often it's quite distorted. And certainly from our perspective, where we work a lot with the transition of migrants into Australian society, that opportunity that they come here for around being able to aspire to the type of living that they want to have and the type of opportunities for their families around education, but also around housing and growth, that's often quite distorted. There's a phrase I've heard, which is, are we really setting them up for success when they choose to come here to Australia? Do you have a view about how that economic growth can be balanced with actually creating some type of balance across all the aspects of our communities?
Look, it's an incredibly challenging issue. So I think there's a lot of debates about the sort of balance of growth and the way we balance growth with equity. And I think there's sort of two big components to that. One is about, what we are doing for those that might be living in poverty or very low income people, the sort of social safety net, to make sure that people, don't end up in a precarious position. So that, those are debates about how much we should be investing in things like Newstart and rent assistance. And I think there's very fair arguments that we don't do enough at the moment. Related to that, there's arguments about the sort of health and education systems and making sure that they're delivering a standard which is helping bring people up and not trapping people in cycles of disadvantage. And there's also arguments around the kind of broader macroeconomic policy settings. What priority should we put on strong labour markets and full employment? Because that's really critical for those things. Yeah. Then there's a sort of a separate set of arguments, which I think brings in some of the things that you were talking about how do we enable, how do we support a thriving middle class? We haven't seen the same hollowing out of the middle class in the way we have seen in places like the US, but I think it's still really important to think about how do we unleash this potential and make sure that people are kind of getting the best of their economic opportunities.
Yeah.
So there you are talking about your kind of skills system, your higher education system. You're talking about things like childcare to support workforce participation, housing, as you've pointed out. Those are all areas where policy can be better. And we've got, a lot to say about the specifics of what that looks like. But, I think we can do better on a lot of these. And, frankly, doing that is in the long-term interests of our country. Nobody wants to see a hollowed out middle class or a country that doesn't take advantage of the fullest potential of its citizens.
Absolutely. Or taking away that aspiration of wanting and being able to realise aspirations about what you can actually achieve when you live in Australia. Just bringing a couple of the pieces together that we talked about earlier, the pace of technological change isn't slowing down. And I'm just wondering, how do you think we can use that pace of change to actually be a cohesive force in Australia? How do we foster people's both understanding of the risks but also taking advantage of the opportunities? And as you mentioned before, is there a role for education in helping to balance that understanding of risk and opportunity where it comes to technological change?
Absolutely. And I think, as I said before, we are lagging, and that says to me there is a big opportunity for us to understand how to employ and utilise these technologies to, do better in, in the production of goods, but also in the way we deliver education, in the way we, can transform our health system. I think there's massive opportunities there in technology, but to get there, we need the people that understand how these technologies work and how to deploy them and feel confident having these conversations. So I think that's a huge challenge and role for our education system going forward. I think the cohesion aspect comes because, you create a lot of well-paid, great jobs, frankly, which is a very good thing for the economy, but also for social cohesion. And potentially you broaden opportunities to work with different groups. These can be quite diverse sectors, and I think that's another positive thing.
One of the things that we have heard is that many people who arrive here from other countries often have a set of views about what it takes to be successful, that is, to be a doctor or a lawyer. But they're not necessarily familiar with all these new types of professions and roles and opportunities. What would you say to a parent that wasn't familiar with all of that about what the opportunity actually is in the future, that it may well be in areas that none of us have even conceived of yet? How do we describe the future to new people that have just arrived?
Well, I have to say this is a classic, Anthea, and it's not just newly arrived migrants. If you survey the whole set of 15-year-olds in this country and you ask them what they're going to be when they grow up, the vast majority will say just 10 professions, and that will include doctor and lawyer and firefighter and the ones that you see in children's books when you are young. So we don't. And if we actually looked at what share of total jobs they are, that would be a tiny fraction. There are so many ways to succeed and thrive in our economy, and a whole lot of jobs that none of us have ever heard of that are making a difference. So I think it's keeping an open mind, focusing. You don't necessarily have to do a very vocational degree, like I do a law degree and I'm going to become a lawyer. Just building a skill set. Mm-hmm. And so when we see the skills that are in demand, economists like boring titles, so they call them non-routine cognitive skills, but basically it is things like collaboration, communication, being able to apply higher level thinking and expertise to problems. Mm-hmm. So building out those skills through education, you might take a particular lens and do that through technology, but there are so many opportunities out there. Businesses are kind of crying out for savvy individuals with a kind of can-do attitude that can do this. So my advice is really just don't think narrowly, don't necessarily think along a straight vocational line. there are already a huge diversity of jobs out there, and that diversity is only going to grow.
Thank you very much, Danielle. I've got just a couple more questions. One is, what message would you give to policymakers when they're thinking about the future? What's the sort of thing they should be thinking of when they start to plan what might be the types of things they want to see in Australia in the next 5 or 10 years?
Look, I think to be bold, and we talked about risk aversion before, I think some of these things are foreseeable. We can see the tech revolution happening. We can see that we need to make progress on climate. I have a degree of frustration that we set up another task force and do another strategy. I think let's just get on with it. A lot of this stuff we know what needs to happen. So let's push on. And I think having faith in Australians to go along on that journey, I think we often underestimate the capacity of all Australians to kind of listen to the reasons for change and embrace that change if people are making a good case for it.
I think making a good case is such an important component. You have to be able to tell the story of why it matters.
But if you do, you can actually see that people will come along, and you can chart this through case studies of different policies, explain it, go through it. That communication piece really matters, but you can bring people along if you've got a good argument.
Absolutely. So I've got one final question, which you sort of just alluded to then, which is how would you describe Australia? What is it that makes Australia Australia?
I think we are egalitarian. I genuinely believe that we have a really egalitarian spirit, and I think we have a can-do attitude. I hope I'm not just projecting my own biases on my picture of the country, but I think those feel to me to be kind of fundamentally part of the Australian spirit. And I know you guys think a lot about migration and cohesion, and I think actually that being a very multicultural society has contributed to that. People self-select into being migrants, and they come with those attitudes, which I think has contributed to what is sort of a great willingness to take on new challenges as a nation.
Thank you so much, Danielle. What a great point to leave on, and absolutely delighted that you've been a part of this final episode of our Voices of Australia podcast series. So thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a great conversation.
Well, Faisal, what a way to finish. Wasn't Danielle fantastic?
I think she's a great final guest to kind of bring all these different topics that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
So, yeah, she was incredible.
And we'd had previously all these examples of really very specific areas, and yet she could talk at that very macro level of how economics and growth and population all play out together.
I don't envy her task, like to be asked to talk about, what is Australia's future, and then having to grapple with so many different places. I think if I really put it down to a few things, which kind of comes back to those other episodes, as this is the final one in our series, this particular series, that leadership element, like the ability to be bold. I think I really liked how she said that, to, take a risk, but
and stop rewriting your strategy every time, but just get down and do it.
Just go and do it. I think that's something that I've always been inspired by hearing how other people approach particularly really complex policy challenges. But the thing that stood out to me, I don't know what you think, Anthea, here, but is that don't underestimate people. People will join you, and they'll come on the journey with you if you're prepared to communicate effectively.
And we've learned how important storytelling is to communication.
Yeah.
So having politicians that can actually paint a picture of where the future might be is usually just the first step in really building people's support for where you want to go.
Well, I noticed, Anthea, you asked, what is Australia? How do you explain it? How would you answer that question?
No, I'm sorry you asked me that, because I hadn't given it much thought. And I think she's right. I certainly think that the Australian intention is to be as egalitarian as possible. I also think that Australia is actually quite a progressive nation. So I think we're very open and flexible to new ideas and new people and new ways of thinking. I think we just don't necessarily remind people about how important that is as a strength for the nation. But what about you? Do you think we're egalitarian?
I think we can be. And I think broadly our system is set up to be egalitarian. But I do think that maybe some of the ways that we're approaching these big challenges that Danielle was talking about today and some of our other guests have grappled with, I think if we aren't bold and we're not prepared to just say, well, we know what we need to do, I do feel that, we are risking some of those really intrinsic, cohesive things that has made us successful. And while I worry, I have a really, optimism that the next generation of Australians will probably say, well, why don't you just do that? People like my sister who would just say, well, you don't need to do it that way. Just, get on with it. Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. I think we do need to get on and do more and be bold and really step up and wherever we can, but not without thinking about how to ensure that everybody is a part of that journey and not leaving people behind. I think that's really important.
Yeah, and also making people feel like they can buy into this idea. Like some of these challenges you were mentioning in that episode about AI and education, etc. If people feel like they're so removed from those challenges, then they might not necessarily see themselves as part of the future or the solution. And that might sound obvious, but it's true. If people don't feel they're connected to their broader society or its future, then they will detach.
It's that what's in it for me type thing. And not necessarily in a selfish way.
Yeah.
Just why should I care about these sorts of things? So.
It was interesting in one of the early episodes with neighborhood and belonging where we talked to Bronwyn and Mo.
Yeah.
One of that idea of the nature of, the Australian identity, people not necessarily identifying with that, but maybe their local neighborhoods.
Yeah.
This episode, I guess we've talked about the macro Australia. I do wonder, in the future, whether that dynamic starts to change. Do you think in the future people start to identify more with Australia, or will we continue down the path of identifying with our neighborhood? What do you think?
Well, I think it's such a good question. And I do hope that through the series, people or our listeners have had the opportunity to see how a number of these different elements play out in thinking about the broader Australia. But it is so complex and so nuanced. It's really important to sort of highlight mental health and integrity and discrimination, all of those different elements, and then think about what does that mean for Australia as a whole. So I want to thank you for all that you've done in preparing us for this series, and also for the enormous background work that you've done in ensuring that our guests know what we're trying to get to, and ensuring that I know where we're going with the series. It's been incredibly important. You've been a wonderful producer for this series, and I hope you're as proud of it as I am. And I hope all of our listeners really enjoy it.
Well, well, thank you, but I think I join you in the last part. I hope people just enjoy at least grappling with some of the, some of those big macro meaty topics that maybe people avoid, and feel like at least we've started a conversation. I would really like to hear what listeners think about some of these things. So I hope people get in contact. I hope people write to us. I also wanted to make some shout outs, particularly to John Bigelow, who's you can't see him on the screen at the moment, or you can't hear him on the mic, but he's been incredibly useful and just such a help to us to get this podcast where it is.
Thank you, John.
I know at the end of each episode we have a little outro, but I wanted to also thank Matthew Skidmore, who's really helped us with a bit of this research background for each episode. And lastly, although I think he'll still be in Greece when this episode comes out, is Agalos, who did an incredible job with us in terms of just conceptualizing this series and even gave us so many ideas for future series. So we'll see how that works.
Yeah. And the other individuals that played a part in helping us develop the brand and the music that we use.
Yeah.
And it's been just a really team effort.
Yeah, particularly with Meg, she's done a wonderful job in helping us, at least give a bit of a design for our podcast. And the last one, I think, is Steve, who's actually made the music. So everything you've been hearing over the last 10 episodes, Steve's done us a wonderful job in making us some music. So yeah, it's been a team effort, but thank you, Anthea. It's been a great
an absolute privilege to work with you too, Faisal. So thank you very, very much. And thank you to our listeners. Yeah. Yes, we look forward to getting as much feedback from you as you wish to pass on.
Yeah, get in touch, write to us. We want to hear what you think. Any ideas for future series and episodes, and we'll see what we can do.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Voices of Australia podcast, brought to you by the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute. This podcast is produced by me, Faisal Farah, and with audio, visual, recording and editing by John Bigelow from Interactive Media Solutions. Research for each episode is provided by Agalos Makrijojos and Matthew Skidmore. Original music is by Steve Klapsinos. Learn more about the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute and all its works by visiting the website www.scanloninstitute.org.au.